5 circular tables were set out neatly around the room, with 4 chairs round each. The floor was checkered black and white with tiles, and across the right-hand wall stood a counter with a selection of pastries, sandwiches and cakes. The room was tastefully decorated and gave every intention of being posh. "Afternoon all," the inspector raised his hat in welcome. A finely dressed youngish couple sat at the table closest to the window, nodded back, but the occupants of the other table turned to each other with alarmed glances. The owners of these alarmed glances were a pair of ladies similar in age and appearance to Mrs. Cole that they had seen in the butcher's, and the inspector gauged that they were the members of the rumour mill he sought. He was also ready to bet that Ivy Cole would be joining them as soon as she could get out of the butcher's. "Morning, young Drew," came a voice from behind the counter, where the proprietor stood over a fresh pot of tea. "What can I do for you and your friend?" "Morning, Phyllis," Drew replied with a friendly smile. "This is an inspector down from London." The conversations in the room ceased as all ears turned to the visitor. "Yes, good morning, Phyllis." The inspector raised his hat again. "Good morning, Inspector," Phyllis replied politely, if a little reservedly. This was to be expected, and the inspector was used to it. The people of the town knew that his presence must mean something serious. "I was hoping I might buy some of your delicious-looking cakes for some hard-working policemen," the inspector asked. "Of course, dear. Have a look. See if there's anything you fancy. I'll be with you in a moment." She loaded a silver tray with fine china cups and the teapot and moved round the counter and through the tables to deliver the tray to the couple by the window. "Here you are, my dears." Phyllis placed down the tray. She was middle-aged, quiet yet confident, and moved with the grace of someone happy with who they were. The inspector and Drew studied the cakes behind the glass eagerly. "They all look delicious. How is one to choose?" the inspector asked out loud to no one in particular. "Go for the one with the most chocolate on," Phyllis advised. "That's what I always do, anyway." "A good tip," the inspector replied. Phyllis returned to the counter. "I'll have an eclair, if I may," he asked. "Of course. And you, Drew?" Drew pondered for a second longer. "A jam donut, please, Phyllis." "Of course. Are those to take away, gents?" "If that's agreeable," the inspector asked politely. "Of course." Phyllis pulled a couple of brown paper bags from underneath the counter. "So what brings you to Firestone, Inspector?" Phyllis began. "If you don't mind me asking, like," she checked herself quickly. "Of course not. The more people who know the better as far as I am concerned. A body was discovered nearby last night by Constable Gates here." The room fell into a deeper silence. Phyllis gulped and turned quite pale for a moment. "In the copse?" she asked in a hushed whisper. "What makes you say that?" the inspector asked leadingly. "Oh, well, my old man always used to tell me tales of things in the copse," she flustered. "It's part of the town, but I never heard anything to back them up, you know. It's like I always expected someone to find something, and they never have." She trailed off, rather worried. "Please do not alarm yourself. I am sure the body's appearance does not mean that any ghost stories you were told as a child have suddenly come true." The inspector spoke carefully, gauging that all the occupants of the tea rooms that day felt the same. "I would like to know if you saw anything strange last night. Anything out of place, any characters around town that you didn't recognise." "Last night, with that storm?" Phyllis stopped for a moment to think. "Nothing springs to mind, but then I was locked up safe in the house most of the day, hiding from the rain." "Of course, and a very wise thing to do too," the inspector nodded. "But if you or anyone come to that—" He turned to include the other occupants of the tea rooms, who turned away and pretended they hadn't been listening. "Think of anything suspicious, or that you might think would be of use to my inquiries, please do not hesitate to come to the station and tell an officer who will pass the details on to me. Or, of course, if you feel the need to talk to me specifically, please tell a member of the local force and they will get your message to me." The 4 customers kept their heads down, refusing to reply or even make eye contact. "Well, the invite is always open," the inspector informed them, when it became clear that their response was going to be a resounding silence. He turned back to Phyllis. "How much do I owe you?" he asked her. "Oh, 2 and 6, please," she replied, her mind on other things. The inspector fished in his pocket and pulled out the correct change for her. "Thank you. We'd best be off. Good afternoon." He raised his hat to her. "Afternoon all," Drew called to them as they headed for the door. As they left, Ivy Cole came bustling in. "Hello, Ivy," Drew welcomed her as they passed. "Constable?" She nodded back curtly and made her way quickly over to her blue-rinsed friends to find out who the man was and what she had missed. The inspector and Drew made their way back out onto the street, and the inspector continued on his way along the road, cakes in hand. "Well, there you have a whistle-stop tour of Firestone's shopping parade," Drew informed him. "What do you think? Probably not much compared to London." "Oh, London is much the same. We just have more shops as there are more of us squeezed into the place." He stood facing Firestone roundabout and passed Drew his cake. They stood eating them for a moment while they waited for a couple of cars to pass before the inspector led them confidently across the road to the stone for a closer look. Drew obediently followed him. "Tell me what you know about this stone," he asked Drew. Drew regarded it. "This is the stone they named the town after. It's called the Firestone because apparently the blood of all the people beheaded on it has stained the stone and it looks like fire, but I can't see it myself." The inspector took a close look at the top of the stone. There was a faded red hue to its appearance, but he decided this was due more to the colour of the rock than the amount of blood spilt on it. From a pocket in his briefcase he produced a small test tube and a sharp digging tool. He scraped a few grains from the rock into the tube, sealed it up and put it back in his case. He took a look along the base of the rock, feeling it gently with his fingers, studying the ancient growth of lichen on its side. On the east-facing side lay sporadic dark patches, scars left where long-dead moss had clung to the stone. "This stone hasn't always faced in this direction," he pointed out. On the north-facing side was a lighter patch of stone, revealing to the inspector that this stone had once laid horizontally on top of another. "It hasn't always been vertical either." He studied the sides carefully and found an outcrop of moss hiding a dip on one side, like a bowl had been carved out of it. "My, look at that," he said, fascinated, as he scooped the moss out onto the ground. "Interesting piece of stone. Any idea where it came from?" Drew was so used to the stone's presence that he barely gave it a second glance. The inspector had found out more about it in 2 minutes than he had ever known. "No, I never thought about it," Drew admitted. "Do you know anything else about it?" "Like what?" "Stories, myths, anything." Drew thought. "I don't think so." "A very enigmatic rock." The inspector opened his case to remove his map and started checking it closely. He marked the stone's location on it and then checked its position in relation to the body. It sat directly north of it. "Interesting," the inspector muttered. Drew studied the map with the inspector, following the familiar roads around the town and the main road east out toward Nettlestone. The inspector opened his case and took out one of the instruments that he had used at the scene of the body. He flicked the switch and the green light began to emit a glow, and at such proximity Drew noticed it also emitted a quiet hum. He started wandering about the roundabout with it and gradually made his way out into the road, walking in a slow, shallow spiral. He would occasionally retreat to the pavement as a car approached, and then continue from the same spot when the car had driven by. As he walked, he scribbled in his notebook, or marked his map. When he had walked as far out as he could, he walked around the stone in a circle, continually checking the instrument or jotting down information in his notebook. Drew simply looked on, not wanting to ask what he was doing for fear of disturbing his concentration. The instrument remained reasonably quiet during this time, giving the occasional change in pitch, but the light stayed green. When the inspector had completed a circuit of the stone, he walked in a straight line towards it from the east, then he turned at a right angle and walked away from it again, heading north. At the sudden change of direction, the box immediately sent out a high-pitched squeal, and the light turned from green to red. As the machine screamed its high-pitched alarm, the inspector carefully traced a path heading south from the stone toward the body. Drew watched and listened, bemused or confused, he wasn't sure. He suddenly became aware that he was not the only member of the inspector's audience. On a corner of the road, leading north from the roundabout, a man had stopped to watch. Drew recognised him as Firestone's vicar, Aldous Squires. Their eyes met, and Drew nodded to show he had recognised his presence. The vicar crossed the road to stand with Drew on the roundabout to watch. "Hello, Drew, isn't it?" Aldous asked, his wisp of white hair flapping a little in the wind. "Yes, Father, nice to see you again." The pair had first met within a week of Drew moving to Firestone, when Aldous had visited him at home to invite him to join the congregation on Sunday. Drew had politely refused, and their encounter since then had been the same simple nod of recognition that Drew had given today. This was the first time they had spoken since the vicar's visit. "Who is he?" Aldous asked. "He's an inspector, down from Scotland Yard," Drew replied. "What's he doing?" They watched him stalk his path. He had a second instrument from his bag now, and was comparing readings, then noting them in his notebook. "Inspecting," Drew answered, not sure how else to explain it. They watched for a few moments more. "Why is he here?" Aldous asked, unable to fathom what he was doing. "There was a body discovered last night in the copse. He has been sent to investigate." "A body? My word!" The vicar was distracted for a moment, and Drew noticed that he had lapsed deep into thought. "Did you notice anything last night, Vicar? Anything you want to talk about?" "No," he answered immediately, but not entirely convincingly. "I'm a very deep sleeper. I didn't even realise how bad the storm had been last night until I left the vicarage a few moments ago to walk into town. Parts of the roads are almost flooded." He turned and pointed up the hill towards the church and his small cottage. The inspector stood on the pavement and continued taking notes, but the instruments were put back in his case. "Were there any casualties, any damage, anything like that?" Aldous asked, concerned there might be parishioners needing comforting. No reports I'm aware of. I'm sure if anyone needed your services, they would know where to find you, Drew replied. I hope so, Aldous replied distractedly. He was busy watching the inspector, and Drew noticed what appeared to be a look of recognition on his face, as if the vicar knew him, but couldn't place where from. The inspector put his notebook away and walked back across to Drew and the vicar on the roundabout where they had been watching him. Good afternoon. The inspector offered the vicar his hand, and he reached out and shook it slowly. I'm sure Drew has told you about me. I'm an inspector down from Scotland Yard. Good afternoon. I'm Aldous Squires, Firestone's vicar, he replied, studying his face carefully. Pleased to make your acquaintance, the inspector informed him. I'm here to investigate the appearance of a body in the woods last night. Did you notice anything untoward towards the hours of midnight and 2 a.m? No, he replied quickly and a little less confidently. As I was just telling Drew here, I slept quite deeply. I wasn't even awoken by the storm, yet which by all accounts was dreadful. Yes, fortunately no one was hurt. The three men stood for a moment in silence. The vicar looked as if he wanted to say something, but it never came. He had stopped staring at the inspector now and seemed agitated to go. An interesting stone, Father. Any clues of its origins? The inspector asked, half in conversation, half in his investigative frame. Aldous was hardly listening, so eager was he to move on. Well, the stories I've heard is that it was used to sacrifice people, hence the red coloration, though I know little more of it than that, he replied half-heartedly. Yes, this is all anyone seems to know about it, the inspector replied, examining a piece of moss on the side. The three men stood quietly for a minute, the intensity of the vicar's discomfort adding to the awkwardness of the silence. Well, nice talking to you, Father, the inspector said, trying to hurry them on. If anything about last night does spring to mind, please contact me via the police station. Oh, yes, of course, the vicar replied thankfully. Well, Drew, we'd best be off, the inspector prompted Drew into action. Indeed, and I have some matters at the vicarage I must attend to. Goodbye, Inspector. See you again soon, I'm sure. He turned and stepped into the road distractedly, only narrowly avoiding being hit by Mr. Jones's empty bread van returning to Nettlewood after delivery to the tea rooms. Mr. Jones shot him a concerned look, but drove onward when he saw he was unharmed. My goodness, Father, are you all right? The inspector rushed over to him. Yes, I'm fine, thank you. He stood in shock for a moment, and then looked up at the inspector. I'm sorry, I really must be off, he told them with a shaking voice, then crossed the road quickly and hurried back up towards his cottage. Drew looked after him for a moment. Everything all right, Drew? The inspector asked, noticing Drew studying the vicar. Yes, I'm sure it's nothing, but he seemed to want to say something to you, Drew replied, and he had just come down the hill from the church. He spotted you and headed straight back up there again. Yes, I noticed too. The inspector looked after him as he hurried off. That is rather odd, he agreed. We'll add paying a visit to Aldous Squires to our list of things to do, the inspector informed him, pulling out his notebook and scribbling some notes. But I do not think now is the time to do it. For now, I am in need of more sustenance than can be offered from an eclair. Are you hungry, Drew? He asked jovially, tucking his notebook back into his coat. Drew smiled back. The deductive persona was put to one side for a moment, and the inspector rubbed his stomach. I could probably eat, Drew replied. It was a marvellous change in the inspector's demeanour, from the official procedure-following lawman he had been all morning to a real hungry person. Somehow, both suited him. Where do people go in Firestone Copse, Drew? Where would be a good place to hear what people think? Drew knew just the place. There's a pub, the Green Man. It's seen better days, but that's where most people like to go. So, to the Green Man it is, lead the way. Drew led them back past the parade of shops, up a slight hill. As they walked, they passed an old man in a cardigan, brown slacks and slippers, picking up broken slates from the road outside his house. Morning, Ernie, Drew called to him. Everything all right? Ernie looked up. Oh, morning, Drew. Yes, not too bad. My roof has seen better days, though, I'm afraid. Oh dear, not too serious, I hope, the inspector interjected. Oh, sorry, Ernie. This is an inspector down from London. Ernie nodded at him in welcome. Afternoon, he replied, more worried about his roof than the inspector's presence. I'm afraid it is this time. Usually I just patch it up, but I've had to get the roofers from Nettlewood over to fix the damage after the wind last night, he said remorsefully, wondering how much it would cost him. Oh dear, hopefully it won't be too bad, Drew reassured him. No, hopefully not, Ernie smiled. You blokes off somewhere, he asked. Yes, we're just off to the Green Man for lunch, the inspector informed him. Ernie leant down and picked up more slate. Well, don't let me get between you and your lunch, fellas. See you later, he urged them on, as he added more broken slates to his armful. Yes, see you later, Ernie. Drew and the inspector nodded respectfully and continued on their way. Charming chap, the inspector commented to Drew. Yes, old Ernie's a character around these parts, Drew smiled. They walked a bit further along the road. So all those instruments you were using, what do they do? Drew asked the inspector as they traversed the hill. The inspector smiled, pleased Drew was taking an interest. "One measures air pressure, another detects electromagnetism, and I have a Geiger counter." Drew listened intently. "And why do you need to use them?" he asked. "All in good time, Drew. For now, let's worry about getting inside for lunch." They continued awkwardly on the thin path, then down another wider road, at the end of which stood the Green Man. The exterior was welcoming. It showed all the signs of a building that had been there a long time and was in no rush to go anywhere. It had almost shrunk into the surrounding buildings, looking like it belonged there. It had the black beams and white fascia of a Tudor design, and the entrance was lower than the street, the roads having been built on and improved since the building had been built. A sign hanging over the street swung in the icy wind. It was adorned with a man's contorted face, constructed from roots and branches, with a tongue of leaves protruding from his mouth, with the words "Green Man" in flaking paint underneath. "Marvellous," the inspector muttered, loud enough for Drew to hear as he pushed the door open and they went from being outdoors to being indoors. The heavy door closed loudly behind them, and a few heads turned their way. They took a step down into the pub and removed their coats and hats, placing them on hooks by the door, then turned to face the saloon bar. The interior was illuminated with low light from two large windows at the front and from the lamps that dotted the walls. Through the yellow haze of cigarette smoke, the inspector could just make out the contents of an archetypal British public house. Placed upon a wall by the bar was a dartboard framed by the pinprick holes of a million missed doubles. Nearby stood a fruit machine, displaying an impressive array of enticing flashing lights that distracted potential customers from the low chances of extracting from it more money than you had put in. Beer mugs nobody ever drank from hung on hooks above the bar between the landlord and the public. Scattered about the small bar area were dark wood tables surrounded by dark wood chairs with red cushioned back and seat. The green glass ashtrays advertised John Smith's bitter, the beer mats advertised Strand cigarettes. Once white walls were sandy yellow from nicotine. The once pristine white ceiling had become so stained over time it had adopted a muddy brown. Drew and the inspector made their way to the bar, and the little man who sat behind it watching them over yesterday's copy of the Mirror stood from his stool to meet them. "Afternoon, gents," he greeted them, almost cheerily. "Afternoon, Lionel. This is the inspector down from Scotland Yard." Lionel regarded them cautiously. "Is it true, then, about there being a body out there?" Lionel asked, nodding vaguely toward the door and losing a little of his joviality. What little conversation the occupants of the pub had been whispering to each other stopped, and the pub became silent. "Yes, I'm afraid so," the inspector answered. He was regretful in his tone, sympathetic at the trouble that the body had caused. "I'm here to clear the whole thing up." "Must be quite serious to get the yard involved," Lionel reasoned aloud. "Standard procedure, I assure you," the inspector assured him and his patrons. "There isn't anything for you to worry about. No one in town is a suspect. I'm just here to ensure all the clues we need to find are found." The inspector was calm and spoke unhurriedly. Lionel unconsciously reached for a packet of cigarettes and lit one as the inspector spoke. "Well, that's good to know," he conceded, blowing out a cloud of smoke as he spoke that added to the haze. "What can I get you, then?" "Do you serve food?" the inspector asked, searching the bar for a menu. "Of course. What sort of thing would you be after? We got soup, or we could do some sandwiches, ham and mustard or beef. Mavis could knock you up some chips if you like." "Yes, that sounds fine," the inspector replied. "And some tea." "What bit sounded fine? The chips?" Lionel frowned at the inspector in confusion. "All of it, twice. I'm ravenous. And some tea, a pot if possible, enough for 4. "Oh, were you expecting someone?" Lionel asked. "No, I just drink a lot of tea. We'll be sat over there, is that all right?" The inspector indicated an empty table by the front window with 4 chairs around it. Certainly. You sit yourselves down. I'll bring you your soup and start on the sandwiches. Ham and mustard or beef?" "Is there any horseradish?" Drew asked Lionel. "I could find you some if you so choose, young Drew," Lionel replied. "Beef and horseradish then, please," Drew confirmed. "Make that 2, please," the inspector asked nicely. "Certainly, gents. Anything else?" "Yes. Where were you last night from around midnight to 2 a.m?" the inspector asked. The landlord laughed. "I was in bed worrying about how much of a pub I would have left standing in the morning." All 3 men laughed. It was a question the inspector had to ask, and hoped spending a little money and using a friendly smile to ask a few simple questions would lead to honest answers. "So there was nothing untowards other than the storm? Was there anyone you didn't recognise? Did you notice anything during the night, perhaps?" the inspector asked, seriously enough. "Well..." Lionel leant across the bar towards them, and the 3 men formed a small conference on their elbows. Mavis said that old George was up and about during the night. Drew smiled and nodded sternly. The inspector awaited further explanation. Old George is what they call the ghost that haunts this place, Lionel was kind enough to oblige the inspector. Well, if you believe in that sort of thing, Mavis always hears him. Can't say I've ever seen or heard anything I couldn't explain, but there you go. He returned to standing upright. I'll get Mavis onto your soup. Go make yourselves comfortable. He wandered through a door at the side of the bar. The two policemen made their way over to the table, the inspector wondering what Mavis might have heard. He noticed heads turning to look at him as he and Drew made for their table. Good afternoon. The inspector nodded to those that held his gaze for long enough. Mostly the locals wanted to study their drinks in silence, but a few heads nodded back. This afternoon's clientele was made up of a few local workmen who had slipped in for an afternoon snifter and a couple of retired gents enjoying half a stout each. The inspector opened his case and removed his map, which was becoming increasingly covered in scribbled notes. He laid it out on the table and noticed the two old men sat watching him, muttering to each other. The inspector nodded to them, and they nodded back. He took in his surroundings, noticing the dull scene through the window. Not much to see out there, he noted, nodding to the view. A damp road and a row of houses was all the window had to offer. Drew glanced out, but he knew the view. He had seen it before. The inspector began studying his map, and Drew looked at it too, trying to fathom what all the markings and notes meant. Gradually the patrons of the bar grew used to his presence in the room, and a low murmur of conversation began again. He murmured. Drew noted the marking of the body, the fallen tree, the line marked out along the route taken by the Major up the Nettlewood Road, and the time he was there. He saw the line that was his own route, also taken last night, up to the body through to the corpse. He followed a line drawn across the map through the body from north to south. The line crossed through the body from the south, struck through the town and outwards to the north past the vicarage. Slightly to the right of the line was the Firestone. Directly on the line sat the pub. There was also a line drawn across the map that cut through the body that went from east to west, the easterly end brushing through the north of Nettlewood. The inspector checked his watch. Time to make a telephone call, he told Drew. Drew didn't take his eyes from the strange notes and readings on the map. There were numbers scribbled over fields, circles and X's connecting readings and times to the map. There's a public telephone over by the bar, Drew informed him. Yes, I noticed on my way in, thank you. Noticing Drew's interest in the map, he pushed it towards him. Here, have a good look. Let me know what you make of it. He walked over to the telephone and lifted a receiver. Having inserted a shilling, he dialed a long series of numbers. Drew spent a few minutes sat wondering at the inspector's scribblings and began trying to guess their meanings. The numbers appeared to be higher in the clearing in the trees around the body, and at the points of the compass where the lines were emanating out. Presently, the rotund figure of Mavis came rolling out with their bowls of soup. Just you, Drew? She asked as she placed the extra bowl down at the empty place. Lionel said you were with a chap from Scotland Yard. Yes, that's right, he informed her, suddenly distracted from his line of thought. He's just using the telephone. Right you are, love, she smiled, and waddled back off to the kitchen. Each time the inspector dialed a number, he had to wait for the number wheel to whir back round to the start before he could dial another. When he had stopped dialing, the receiver clicked, buzzed for a few seconds, and then rang once before being picked up. Rank, number and position, please, a man's voice asked immediately. Inspector, 99473, Scotland Yard, case 4199. I need to report a 347. Hold the line, please, Inspector, came the official's voice. The telephone clicked, hummed again, and then was picked up without ringing. 347, give the position of appearance, please. 52.232802 to 0.711735. A pause. Thank you. Position confirmed. Condition and whereabouts of traveller? Deceased, unfortunately. He is currently being examined by Dr. Ward. Estimated distance of travel? The man asked. 60 to 65 years. Based on? Date of birth on driving licence. Name? The man asked the inspector. Matthew Barrow. The man's pen scribbled. The inspector could just hear it between the questions being asked and the answers being given. We'll have a check ready for you on your next report. That would be useful. I believe there to be a tangible cause, and that I might be able to find or even replicate it if I could produce an increased magnetic field, the inspector informed him. Hold on. The man paused again, and the line went dead for a moment. I can have a field enhancer with you tomorrow morning for 11. Where are you staying? Well, now that would be useful. If you could have it delivered to Nettlewood Police Station, the courier can collect my first report at the same time. Also, I think there's a possibility of a 183. There was a pause while the man finished scribbling his notes. I'll put you through. The telephone clicked and hummed for a little longer than before, as the first man explained the situation to the second. Eventually a bright voice came on the line. 183, go ahead, Inspector. One confirmed sighting, leading to the discovery of the body. No luck on a location for a point of origin. Investigations continue. The inspector listened as more scribbled notes were made. Continue investigation. Do not attempt contact. Send full report with your 347. Anything else? Yes, can you put me through to information? Certainly, hold the line. The line buzzed and clicked for a few moments. Information. Go ahead, Inspector.
Yes, I will need a full history on the town of Firestone Copse.
Details of the area, landmarks, maps, whatever you can find. I have something delivered with the enhancer. Anything else? Yes, I have a rock sample that I need an origin for. I'll include it with my report. Also, I need to know as much as you can find out about the sergeants of Firestone Copse and the circumstances surrounding the death of one named Albert Gates. The inspector watched his soup cooling on the table. Noted. Anything else? No, that's all for now. My lunch is here, so I'll be off. Report ends. Report received. Bye, Inspector. They hung up their receivers, and the inspector walked over to his steaming soup. Chapter 14. Drew was already chewing a mouthful of soup-soaked loaf and dipping for more before the inspector returned. Wonderful! The inspector sat with an unhidden glee and began tucking in. He took one of the thick slices from the blue china plate and folded it in two, then immersed it in the soup for a few seconds. He brought the dripping slice up to his mouth, blew on it for a moment, and then put it carefully into his mouth and chewed. The bread had the smell of being freshly baked that always made his stomach rumble in anticipation. Chicken and leek, one of my favourites, he spluttered at Drew, who was also enjoying the meal. Warms you in this cold weather, Drew replied through his mouth of soggy bread. Both men began spooning soup into their eager mouths, and soon their bowls were empty and the dregs were being scooped onto the crusts. As both men sat back and took a deep, satisfied breath, Mavis reappeared to collect their empty bowls. "Hello there, everything all right, I hope, Inspector?" she asked. Her smile suited her rounded figures. She displayed all the affections of a woman who enjoyed eating good food as much as she enjoyed preparing it. She waddled around under a voluminous dress, wearing an apron splattered with the scars of a busy day in the kitchen. "Indeed, madam, by far one of the most delicious soups I have ever had," the inspector replied as he stacked the bowls onto the empty bread plate. "I believe you have the advantage of me, madam," he informed her. "Really? How so?" she replied, a little concerned. "Well, you seem to know who I am, but I do not believe I have had the pleasure yet." "Oh, I see, yes, I'm sorry. I'm Mavis," she told him, blushing to be spoken to so politely. "I run the place while Lionel over there sits on his arse all day," she joked. "Oi, cheeky!" Lionel called back to her, and for a moment the bar was filled with a few howls of good-hearted laughter. "Well, you certainly make a fine soup," the inspector complimented her when the locals had calmed down a little. "Oh, I am glad to hear you enjoyed it," she replied, never losing her smile. "Mavis, this is the inspector down from London," Drew informed her, in case she wasn't sure. "Yes, Lionel told me who you were here with, Drew," she replied appreciatively. "Hello, Inspector. You'll be here because of the poor chap in the woods, then?" she asked. "Yes, that's right," the inspector replied, amazed at how quickly news could travel in a small town. "I was wondering if I could ask you about your uninvited guest."